Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting jewishinsider.com. We are delighted to be joined today by Zev Krengel, Vice President and former National Chairman and President of South African Jewish Board of Deputies, the official umbrella organization of the Jewish community there. Zev is a dear friend of AJC, and we are looking forward to this wide-ranging conversation. Moderating today's program is Eliseo Newman, Director of AJC's Africa Institute. After we hear from Zev and Eliseo, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Before turning it over to Eliseo, Marian Bergman, Chair of AJC's Africa Institute, was planning to offer opening remarks for today's program, but due to some unforeseen technical issues due to the hurricane facing the East Coast in the United States, she regretfully is unable to join us. Thankfully, she was able to send in this brief video to start us off.
Welcome to today's AJC Advocacy Anywhere session with a special focus on the legacy and outlook of South Africa's Jewish community. One of the great blessings of our family is to be able to have a multifaceted identity as Americans, as South Africans, and as Jews. AJC is the unique home that has helped us fine-tune these distinct elements into a rich identity through the Africa Institute that my husband Stanley and I co-founded in 2006. In some ways, the life of South African Jews was much like a Passover plate, mixing the sweetness of a rapidly prospering, supportive Jewish community and the bitterness of a beautiful but cruel land that was generous to precious few and ruthless to most, based merely of the color of a person's skin. In South Africa's apartheid, although Jews were white, for the most part, we were aware of our surroundings. I was raised with Jewish values of social justice and always was aware that apartheid was wrong. Some South African Jews stayed and accommodated to the circumstances. Others stayed and struggled for a more just society. Yet others, like us, having lost hope, left searching for a new home. And in the United States of America, we joined the inviting quest to help build an ever more perfect union. But we left a part of our hearts there and have endeavored to contribute through AJC's Africa Institute to the democratic transformation of South Africa. Today, you will hear from someone who stayed. His generation rejuvenated Jewish participation in South Africa. Zev Krengel came of age as the country was changing, and he had the courage to lead. Zev led the community with remarkably precocious vision, sensitivity, dedication, and savvy. There is probably no one better to explain the Jewish point of view or the Israeli predicament to the general public in South Africa, and especially its government. And there is no one better to explain the social and political complexities that South Africa represents for an audience of committed Jewish advocates. Zev is also a fearless, generous friend. He has hosted AJC countless times, most recently last year when AJC senior lay leadership, visited South Africa and Mozambique. and he has expanded the ranks of partners and friends in all walks of the country's rich life. With that, I am delighted to hand the floor to Eliseo Newman, the director of AJC's Africa Institute, who will lead our discussion.
Thank you so much, Marion. Zev, it's wonderful to see you again. We wish it were physically, as we did in our visit exactly a year ago, during which you and the entire board leadership, both in Gauteng and the Western Cape, extended the most generous hospitality to our president, Harriet Schleifer, our past president, Stan Bergman, Marion, and several members of AJC's Executive Council and Board of Governors. For our audience, Zev is currently Vice President of South African Jewish Board of Deputies, the umbrella organization of South Africa's Jewry, but there is virtually no communal leadership position he has not attained, and that is all the way up to National President and Chairman. We have a great deal to cover today. Briefly, given that South Africa is the country in Africa most affected by COVID, please give us an update on how you're coping. How has the Jewish community organized itself to deal with the crisis, and what is its contribution on COVID to society at large?
First of all, Marion, thank you so much. It sounded like my mother wrote your speech for you, so thank you. And yeah, Eliseo, and really to the AJC, we as in South African Jewry, we small. It's complicated cases, and to have the AJC as a big brother from American Jewry and from America, your help towards this community has just been unbelievable. You've never not helped us, and in many sensitive and less sensitive events, we just call it, it's like really our big brothers. So the AJC, we've had a close relation for many years, but never think it goes unnoticed. And one of the reasons we can bat above our weight division in South Africa with our government and in society is just because of friends and family like the AJC, especially in America, where America is South Africa's second biggest trading partner after Europe. That's almost basically the biggest trading partner in a country. The other one's the continent, or the EU as they call it. So really to the AJC and to the American Jewish community at large who show interest in this little community at the tip of Africa, it's hugely appreciated, and it doesn't go unnoticed. Yeah, the COVID was interesting. We came in late, which was the blessing. Our government under President Cyril Ramaphosa, who took over from President Jacob Zuma, was unbelievably corrupt. Period of 9 years. He went in hard, he listened to science. We've got a very good Minister of Health, which the AJC met a year ago. Israeli McKees, who I've actually been to Israel with, who's a good friend of the Jewish community, and they took it very seriously. And we did a very hard lockdown, but the economy got heavily affected. I mean, it's an economy that the majority of South Africans, I mean, we sit on any given day between 27 and 29% unemployment. We have a social grant system, so it's quite, everyone is given money who doesn't work. But when the COVID came in, it was very difficult. And it's a society that has very rich and very poor, and a lot of people are very close together. And we never flattened the curve, as we say, we pushed it out. And we very hard lockdown for 3 weeks, the president for another 2, only essential services. And then what happens in South Africa is the virus starts getting momentum in society as we start opening up. So now we're the 5th highest cases in the world. Our mortality rate, thank goodness, is still very low. In the Jewish community, we really have done well. The Jewish community is about 60,000 in total. Cape Town got hit harder first with the COVID, and Johannesburg Jewry is now being hit hard. I mean, in reality, the figures we're looking at of the 60,000, we've had about 120 deaths from direct COVID-related incidents, which would be in the Jewish community. At large, the whole of South Africa is at about 8,000 with over 520,000 cases, known cases. So the community closed the schools early, closed for the synagogues, closed the schools early. The Jewish Board of Deputies, we created a COVID crisis committee between education, welfare, chief rabbi, all the different. So two Jews, three different opinions, and we've also had two unbelievable consultants. The one's Dr. Richard Freeland, who's the head of the biggest private hospital chain in South Africa called the Netcare, and then Professor Barry Shube, who was the head of infectious diseases in South Africa. He was the Fauci of South Africa for many years through the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And I must say the two of them have been unbelievable to the Jewish community. And we at the board have really got them to be the sounding board for all the other organizations. So we're in the throes of it. It looks like we've peaked now, and it looks like we're coming down. Cape Town's definitely coming down, hopefully Gauteng, Johannesburg, which those are the two largest. And then the smaller centre, which is Durban, which is part of a province called KwaZulu-Natal, they still peak. So they're on the upward trend. Cape Town's definitely on the downward trend, and Johannesburg seems to be on the downward trend. We've had our third week of less infections. Our private hospitals aren't full. We haven't had the horrific scenes of mortuaries, in back of trucks. I think just to put in perspective how that has affected, in Johannesburg, the Jewish burials were 118 for July of 2020. Generally for the July month, which is our winter, burials in the Jewish cemetery between 50 and 60. So in reality, it's the most Jews that have ever been buried in the history of South African Jewry in 1 month, 118. Majority have been older. So it's definitely affected the community, but we never got as affected as other parts of the Jewish community in Paris or London, which got the virus earlier.
Thank you very much, Zev. Our sympathy are with all in the community who are struggling with this and in positions of leadership to help society at large. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the history of the community and how it has defined the cohesive, communal, and concentrated institutional life that is so characteristic of it. How large is the community? You've already mentioned the number. How urban? How religiously observant, how prone to educate its children in Jewish schools, how Zionist.
So, I mean, the South African Jewish community is a fascinating community. We're almost 95% from Lithuania. I mean, most of us are Litvaks. We came in, there were Jews that came, I mean, the first Jews really came in the 1652 is when South Africa is founded by the European nations, the Cape Dutch Indies. So already from the early days, the first minion in Cape Town must have been in the early 1800s. But the real influx of Jewry comes when diamonds were found in Kimberley, and of course then when the gold was found in Johannesburg in 1886. So the first community, the first organizations, we call it the Chevra Kadisha, which of course is the burial society, but became a very big welfare part in the community. But it was a very cohesive community because it really came out of little shtetls in Lithuania. So it was an unbelievably cohesive and organized community from the beginning. And then it goes through very different phases. We were at our height in the late 60s, early 70s. We were about at 120,000. And I mean, I suppose if there wasn't immigration, we'd be close on 250,000 today. But the apartheid laws really affected the community, although we were part of the white privilege. And we had all the privileges of the whites. Some people like Baron and Stan just, it was too hard to see what was happening. I mean, other Jews, the famous case against President Mandela was his defending lawyer was Jewish and the prosecutor was Jewish. So the Jews were on both sides throughout. I do think we could have maybe done more as a cohesive community body. But really 90% of all the whites that, fought in the struggle, that fought against the horrific oppression of apartheid were Jewish. So it was quite interesting that the majority of whites who had to give up their privileges, in that arena. It was a vicious government. I mean, it really was horrific what they did. So the community did benefit from the apartheid. We were part of the white economy. We were never really part of Afrikaans or the government. Very few were. And it had a very strong relationship with the government. It does sour in the 80s when Israel eventually puts on sanctions after America put pressure on Israel. But where we found ourselves in the new democracy was the government of Israel and the apartheid government. And it really happens in the early 70s. Israel, it's your Zionism equals racism, gets passed at the UN. There's a lot of laws against South Africa, and put two naughty kids in a corner, they'll become friends. And the Israeli government and the apartheid government get very close. There's quite a bit written upon it, but militarily, scientifically, nuclear, there was a lot done together, which that has made a lot of the other issues which we'll discuss later. But then coming out of democracy, it was quite hard for the community, because although there were a lot of South African Jews who fought under apartheid for the ANC, for liberation, a lot of them had a lot of issues with the community because they didn't, they didn't do what they felt they should have. And then a lot of them had a lot of issues with Israel and Zionism. So we have lived in a very, very complex scenario. Me personally, I get involved in communal life very young. I came through B'nai Akiva. And then I always felt that we had to get more of a voice, and we had to be more engaging.
I'd like to focus specifically on the issue of race, because otherwise it's impossible to understand the dynamics that affect the country's politics generally and the agenda of an organization like AJC specifically. One of the legacies of apartheid is the dominance of group and race identities in its political arena. The majority, understandably, is very focused on its own unconsolable historical grievance. To most South Africans, however, Jews are primarily white, oftentimes wealthy, with a strong kind of internal solidarity, such as you've described. But Jews are not prone to see themselves as quintessentially white, and victimhood also features prominently in our identity. Without getting yet into the full dimension of the Israel story in South Africa, which we intend to do a little later, how has the Board of Deputies found the best way to do community outreach beyond itself in South African society? What are the channels? What groups have you reached out to? What kind of leadership?
So it's funny, two types of Jews almost came out of Eastern Europe, where, we were really treated terribly. We were treated as second-class citizens there. Some of them came, and they did very well, and they actually didn't treat their fellow black South Africans nicely. And whether during the struggle, what also people need to understand is the ANC was very much in alliance with the Soviet Union, with Russia, with Cuba, with China. And the European and American philosophy, and still today, that perpetuates still in the government. The government will still trust. There's the famous story of President Zuma when they came, he got poisoned, and he was told by the Americans, he got on a plane and went straight to Russia to confirm it. You never trust the Americans. So we've always lived with that. As South African Jewry, we've always pivoted towards Europe being European or ex-European, and America, the Western world. So out of that came, there's different layers of racism. The irony in South Africa is there's very little pure racism. Even in the heart of apartheid, really what was Afrikaner doing was he wanted to keep power. So he had his big fights with the British in what's known as the Anglo-Boer War. He felt he was the oppressed. He took the shackles off from the British Empire, and he felt, well, I'm the white man in Africa, and this land belongs to me. And then you had Jan Smuts, which there wasn't a vote, even in a liberal white government. But then once the more conservative white government gets into power in 1948, they institutionalized the racism. The very interesting thing is whites and blacks of South Africa have always had to live with each other and understand, it's a society that you can't move elsewhere. There's no separation. It's all in between. So yes, the apartheid government tried hard where live, and blacks couldn't live in white suburbs and all the rest of it. But as time went on, and the pressure of the world and the economy, and apartheid starts falling apart, those got more blurred. What is interesting and we saw it with our corrupt president under President Zuma was races. you actually had a company, I mean, it was a British company called Bell Pottinger, which had created what was called white monopoly capital and all the rest of it. And they're trying to create more racism for theft in reality. And I must say, under President Cyril Ramaphosa, that has really come a lot less. So your actual race tension is there. It's quite interesting. Politically, generally, the ANC and the EFF are black parties, and the Democratic Alliance is a white party. And then when it came to sport, which was a very big part, the rugby, which is similar to American football, was always the white man's party, the Springbok. And then the football, the soccer, any other country that calls it soccer is America, South Africa, who knows why. But the soccer, which is very much a black sport. And in South Africa, sports defined us differently, but sports also brought us together. And I mean, winning the Rugby World Cup with the first black captain, it was just an unbelievable moment where blacks and whites celebrated together for a sport that actually brought us apart. So I'm still very confident in South Africa's race relations. I really believe we can come right. I still feel today it's more economic than colour of the skin. I believe on both sides, the majority of blacks and whites, and coming out of the vicious apartheid era. And what I've always admired about the ANC and the leaders of Mandela and the leaders of President Mbeki and the likes was how they were prepared to forgive. You know, we had what was called the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I mean, you had the white government literally. I mean, they were torturing, they were killing. I mean, some of the stuff's the most horrific stuff you've ever heard. And you came in, you showed remorse, and you apologized, and you got it scot-free. I mean, part of the Mandela de Klerk endgame. So President de Klerk was our last white president of the illegitimate government, who voluntarily gave over power to a black president. You know, and gave up the very, very few times you have a minority giving up power voluntarily. Look, there was a lot of pressure on them, but they could have held on. They could have held on for longer. And the last bit, it's a piece of legislation that still blows my mind. It was called the Sunset Clause. And eventually, President Mandela said to the white government, well, what will make you feel more comfortable? And they said, we're worried about losing the jobs of whites in government. And they guaranteed all the whites in government another 5 years of job security in the government. So that was the level of understanding and bringing down the race wall, if you want to call it. And I think it was quite well received. It was well received because, I mean, you have had a far right backlash, but very small. But generally today, the real line is of the have and have-nots. And because the whites had all the privilege, because the whites could own property, were part of the economy, had a better education, we've just got a much bigger advantage than an average black person who was brought up in apartheid. The problem with that is then we had what was BE, which is it was to try and level the playing fields economically, and you had to have black ownership, and blacks could be promoted over whites. So the counter problem with that has become a lot of black people have got wealthy, and a lot of corruption has got stuck in government where they want to get wealthy quickly in those positions. And that's also left a frustration out of white South Africans who feel they can't get promoted, and black South Africans who can't also get promoted, and then some just keep promoting and keep getting the deals. So for me today in South Africa, it's more about economic have and have nots. And unfortunately, the South African economy hasn't done well. We were doing brilliantly until the late 2000s under President Mbeki and President, our finance minister, Trevor Manuel. And then when President Jacob Zuma comes in, and it's a family called the Guptas, which you watch, they literally stole the country blind. And I mean, it's put us back to 10, 15 years, if we ever recover, you know. And for me, the real, where we as a community is, we are dwindling. There is immigration again. People are frustrated. People are nervous. And the nervous is there a future for South African Jewry in South Africa? I really do believe. I think South African Jewry, we've never had a pogrom. Our levels of anti-semitism are some of the lowest in the world still today. Before COVID, during COVID, we have a government that listens to us. I think we can, as a community, be more sensitive to understand what the average black South African went through. We like to criticize, and apartheid is never going to go away, and people still try and blame apartheid for not having that economic. There's a far left party called the EFF, the Economic Freedom Front. A guy, Julius Malema, is in charge. And, his whole big thing is, it's the white monopoly capital. It's the whites control the economy, and we're never going to get out the shackles. And although it's the breeding ground for race relations, in reality, politically, there's a one man, one vote concept. In government, blacks do totally own, but when it comes into white business and capital business, and that's the danger. The danger sits that there's still a feeling of capitalism, and a free market is not the way to go. And you need to nationalize, you need to go for the banks, and that always causes a bit of tension. So for me, it's more economic tension, but it's still not going away.
You mentioned rugby as a unifying phenomenon, and we should stress that in the history of Jewish sport, the date of June 24th, 1995 stands out. Maybe you want to talk very briefly about that, because we want to move on to the issue of Israel and South Africa.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great, in 90, I sat in the Peace Accord, which was a very interesting organization from 92 to 94, where we were the buffer between the police that were very brutal and your black population. And there was quite to understand South Africa, you really have to understand that there's not a cohesive black people. It's all tribes. So you get a Zulu tribe, you get a Xhosa, you get a Venda, you get a Pedi. That's why President Ramaphosa, it's unbelievable. He comes from a very small tribe called the Venda. And I mean that he's in charge of that. The ANC was always the Xhosa party, which always sits more on the Western Cape, close to Cape Town. And then you get to a Zulu party, which really sat KZN. So it's still very, very tribal, if you understand it. So there was a lot of tensions, 92 to 94, black on black violence, the police causing, are we going to get through it? And at the time, during sanctions, we weren't allowed to play rugby, cricket, even come to the Olympics, which started opening up thanks to Mandela. But the real symbol of apartheid for an average black South African was the Springbok. And the Springbok was a symbol because he couldn't become a Springbok because he was black. So, and even when the New Zealand or the Australians used to come and play rugby, they weren't allowed to sit in the stadium with whites. So you'd have a 90,000-seater stadium, and there'd be like a place for 5,000 black South Africans. And they weren't allowed, and they would support the opposition team. They would support the New Zealand team. They would support the Australian team. So if the Springboks, the South Africans would score, 80,000 would scream and go nuts. And if the opposition, South African blacks would go mad because it was the oppressor being beat. So that was the level of tension, in the 60s and even in the 70s. And then, of course, we allowed back in sport. And Mandela they try and get rid of the Springbok. And I mean, even when we go to the Olympics, it's under the Protea, which is our national. But the Springbok, Mandela is determined not to lose. And that for me was one of his great moments. I mean, even the union buildings where the government sits was the bastion of apartheid. And it's a great moment where the World Cup, where we've been out of World Rugby, we should have had no chance. And somehow we just keep winning everyone. It's a guy, Francois Pienaar. There's a great movie, Invictus.
You were locals. You were the World Cup was in South Africa itself.
Yes. So what happens is the World Cup is given to South Africa because it's the new, but it's still a lot of tension. Your black South African was very, very cautious. He wasn't happy at the time. Mandela pushes it through. And then it's the great moment where the great rivalry between, it's called the All Blacks, which are the rugby team, and the South Africans, which were the Springboks, come to play at Ellis Park. And we were the big underdogs, although the majority of South Africans supported, black and white. It was the first time you really had black South Africans supporting, and it was still an all-white team. There was one coloured player called Chester Williams, and he was it. But there was unbelievable on both sides. So for the first time, because of Sikeleli, which was the struggle song, which becomes part of the anthem, white South Africans still can't sing it. Because, I mean, it's mainly in the black language, and the whole rugby team sang it. And then the great moment is it's a draw, and at a draw, we were going to lose. And then it's Joel Stransky's a Jewish, the Jewish South Africans aren't built for rugby, which has to be a lot bigger. And he scores the final points of the game. So it's our great moment. We haven't had a Jewish Springbok since. And the Irish, I've always said, there's a minion of Springboks in the Hall of Fame. 10 Jews have been Springbok rugby players. So Joel Stransky was our last one, and he won the World Cup.
Let's move to the South Africa-Israel story. As many in the audience know, the relationship is complex and heavily conditioned by the history that you mentioned. And many in the audience will have heard that in late 2017, the ANC, which is South Africa's erstwhile liberation movement, and since 1994, the dominant ruling political party, in its policy conference recommended the downgrade of South Africa's embassy in Tel Aviv. You alluded, but maybe you want to elaborate a little bit further on the the Cold War legacy of friendships on the one hand between the ANC and the PLO, and the ties between Israel and apartheid South Africa around military and commercial issues. And while at it, maybe I'll add the question that makes this more relevant to today. We know that there's a significant Muslim community that was discriminated against during apartheid and played a very important role in the transformation of democratic South Africa when things with Ahmed Kathrada. Similarly, there are very large and devout Zionist churches, many of them black, that are also very vocal. For example, Chief Justice Mogoeng of the Constitutional Court recently spoke out publicly as a Christian in favor of Israel. So what are the constituencies in South Africa's current political arena that have an influential voice that affects official decisions on the Israel-South Africa relationship?
You can see as you started talking about the Israel side, I got hot under the collar. I had to take off my, we call it a jersey. So look, it's very complex, and unfortunately, the history doesn't really give Israel enough credit for what it did do in the times. But Israel and the ANC during the 50s and 60s were actually quite close. I mean, when Mandela wants to leave the country to go overseas, the only airline would take him out in the 60s was El Al. And that was very much because of socialism and communism, where Israel was sitting with its socialist opinions and, you know, favoring the communists. And I mean, the ANC, that all really changes in the 70s. The 70s change where the apartheid government and the Israeli government militarily work very closely together. From the Mirage, which the French fighter jet, which goes to the Israelis, and then they upgraded to what was called the Kafir at the time, to South Africa. We upgraded ours to the Cheetah. It was all the same technology. But it was the two naughty boys in the corner. And that gets very, very close. In the same period, your ANC, which is really very, very close to the Soviet Union, most of them, we have a war in a neighbor of a neighbor, what was called Angola, where the Soviet Union sent Cubans to fight with the ANC against the South African government. And it's quite an interesting, because it was 75. It was 75 at the time. The South Africans actually do it with the consent and the help of the Americans at the time. So at that period, the ANC is getting closer and closer to the PLO. And the South African government, the apartheid government, and the Israelis are getting a lot closer. In the 80s, and to understand the apartheid government, also if you go into in the history of South Africa, I mean, for Wit Malan, who come into power in the late 40s and the 50s, they were part of the Nazi youth. So there was always a far-right element in the apartheid government. And the apartheid government was always, you know, you're white, you're Jewish, you've got the vote, but, you know, stay out of politics, don't, you're still Jewish, you know. So some of the hardest anti-Semitism did come out of that right. But with the South African government getting so close, that almost becomes, the Afrikaner started seeing himself as the Jew in the Middle East, and he's got a biblical right to South Africa. And that gets permeated really in the 70s and 80s. And then Israel actually put sanctions. As I said, America eventually put pressure on Israel, and then the Board of Deputies gets called into the apartheid government, and we basically get threatened at the time. So, and then what happens is Mandela comes out of jail, and it's all in South Africa. Everyone's trying to work together, and it's the same time as when Oslo's happening between Yasser Arafat and Prime Minister Rabin. So a lot of the issues get like put on the side. And what's interesting is with the ANC, they become more free market. They realize that communism is not working, and they better get a bit more free market if they want to South Africa. It's one of the real reasons that the end of apartheid does happen is the the fall of the Berlin Wall really allowed the Western nations to get much more behind, because it wasn't a bigger conflict now being fought out. And that's when the Afrikaans government realized that they were getting squeezed by now the Western, more free market allies, if you want to call them. And it's funny, a lot of American Jewry think they were the ones who brought down apartheid because of all the unbelievable good work that American Jewry did do. But if you still speak to an average ANC, he still sees America as the one who made apartheid last longer. He will still trust the Russians and the Chinese far better than the Americans. So it's quite a complicated scenario. But in the 90s, when we're going through our healing process, Oslo's happening, and there's never healing between the Israeli government and the ANC. So Mandela does go to Israel. They're still talking, but it's all very much reliant on the Oslo Accords. The Oslo collapses in the late 90s, and then you have the Second Intifada. And that's really when the ANC's viciousness towards Israel comes. We go to The Hague against the apartheid war. And there was no healing process. There was no TLC. So the ANC and your black South African had forgiven his direct perpetrator, but he had never forgiven one of his direct perpetrators' allies, which was the government of Israel. And of course, Mandela said it. So he always said the South African people will only be freed when the Palestinian people are free. But that was always said throughout the time. So it was complicated. And then it gets very, very tough. I must say, in the early 2000s, we have some of our toughest periods here with the government and the rhetoric towards Israel. And I must say, we worked hard. The AJC, Stan and Marion were unbelievable in those early days with President Mbeki explaining it better. And we slowly start showing the situations more complex. And it's not all Israel is the apartheid regime oppressing the PLO, poor Palestinians, which is equated to the ANC being the poor, being the poor Palestinian equivalent to the apartheid government being the minority oppressing them. So it's taken us a hell of a long time of engagement to show the difference. In the ANC, it was always very much your Indian community in South Africa, which you get Hindu and Muslim, has always been very involved in the ANC. They weren't part of the white privilege. They weren't part of the white like we were. So they were very much closer in the trenches with the ANC. They had much more influence. And the relationship has been a very, very complicated one. As I said, as a son of South Africa and as a proud Zionist, I've always lived between my mother hating my father hating my mother, And it's a difficult place to be. And we have definitely had ups and downs. I mean, the irony is under President Zuma, who was incredibly corrupt, he held the ANC and he understood the complexity. He was Christian himself. President Ramaphosa, he's trying to not make it an issue. He's trying to downplay it. And we get caught, actually. The whole downgrade, which you talk about, really becomes a fight. The majority Muslim influence in the ANC push very hard for that rhetoric. And it's really to embarrass Cyril, because Cyril goes into business with a lot of Jewish business friends originally. But they try and embarrass him that he's getting money from Jews. And that gets highlighted in what was called Nazareth, which was the famous policy conference where they vote as a party to downgrade, to show to punish Israel in a sense. I mean, our point of view is we've worked on both sides. The Israelis have very little time for South Africa. We're not an economic powerhouse. We're not we're not a scientific powerhouse. And they really do it to look, to be good to South African Jewry and listen. And they put up a lot with the South African government. And then the South African government, I think if they had their way, would get much more vicious on Israel, which I don't think would be the correct thing. And I think they also do it because the South African government's a complex being. He really does believe that Israel's in the wrong. And when I say that, I'm talking about you take a President Mbeki who's Christian, he's black, he's cause, he's unbelievable, he's not corrupt, an unbelievable human being. But he really does believe that Israel could do more for peace. And it has been more complicated in the last couple of years. It hasn't been easier for us. So that's the older black leadership of the ANC always feels that Israel, hasn't done well, or could have done more, or could have been more like the National Party. But your younger black South Africans, you're part of the ANC. They really want a house, they want a car, they want a job, they want education, and they're also Christian. And there's definitely been a pushback. There's been a pushback in the ANC's policy, but it's you get very, very ostracized if you're an ANC member and you proudly Zionistic or you proudly support Israel. You'll be very, very ostracized for it. It's not a good political career move. And that's really kept a lot of your mainstream Jewish South Africans outside of politics, outside of the ANC, because it's a complex environment to be. So the ANC supports a two-state solution. It supports Israel's right to exist, in secure borders. It will give you all very much where we as a Jewish Board of Deputies have a very similar view. But it's hard to get there. We believe that, Yasser Arafat and the PLO, especially the Second Intifada, there hasn't been a willingness to make peace, and there's been a lot of hands being given by Israel. And today the ANC government feel that the current Israeli government, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, doesn't want peace, and you have to put more pressure on Israel, and you have to make Israel more of a pariah, like they did so well against the white apartheid government. So it's very complex. We really don't see eye to eye with the majority, but they have started coming out because we engage, but it's not simple.
I'd like to ask you one last question, and I apologize that it's a rather vast subject, but if you could tackle it for our audience, given that this is a particular focus of our Africa Institute. You've spoken about the tough times in the early 2000s in explaining Israel, we at AJC and everywhere worry about the borderlines between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and that borderline is measured very differently depending on conditioning factors such as the ones you've been outlining so eloquently. We want to focus on the issue of South African universities, since it's quite critical for any Jewish community to survive somewhere, for it to survive, that it be able to educate the younger generations suitably. In our visit, we were struck by the fact that to a Jewish person that we interacted with, there was no anti-Semitism in South Africa. I mean, that's a very strong view held by most in the Jewish community. And yet, we had Durban in 2001, internationally BDS and the legitimacy of the apartheid analogy to Israel draw heavily on the validation of vocal local groups. And Jewish students yearly face perhaps the most vitriolic version of Israel Apartheid Week in the world. As we speak, the Constitutional Court is expected to render a landmark hate speech case, which is interestingly surrounds an event in which a leader of COSATU, the trade union body that participates in the ruling coalition, made in a South African university, is one of the country's leading universities, WITS. How do South African Jews, young and old, settle on the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Yeah. So, I mean, on a broader base, I think it's important for all, and I think unfortunately America's starting to really feel more anti-Semitism and more anti-Israel rhetoric. So for us, in the COVID pandemic, we were behind the rest of the world, but I think on this pandemic, if you go back to European anti-Semitism, it was, under all what Herzog believed was if you had a little piece of sliver of land, you would stop anti-Semitism because you could take all the Jews out of Europe and you could put them on this biblical homeland and there won't be a problem. Now, your new anti-Semitism might say, no, if you get rid of the state of Israel, there'll be no anti-Semitism. So I often say to the South African government, not all pro-Palestinians are anti-Semites, but all anti-Semites are pro-Palestinian because you can hate Jews for free. And especially in South Africa, where there's a real acceptance of being pro-Palestinian and wearing the kafir and all the rest of it. And I really do believe there are genuine people that feel that if Israel extended a hand and the Palestinians took it, and they don't have an anti-Semitic, they're not bigot, they're not racist, they're not anti-Semitic. That's the fine line. For me, the bigger issue we deal with is not basic anti-Semitism of just hating Jews. A lot of people hate Jews because we play as in history, because Israel's strong, because it's in the forefront of economic, because it's the forefront of militarily. And it's the play of history that creates a lot of anti-Semitism, in a sense that I don't hate you as an individual Jew, but as long as you're a second-class citizen, I can live with you. And I think a lot of that time, that's where we have to explain. When it comes to the ANC truly is a party. And I mean, it's an amazing document. It's called the Freedom Charter, if you Google it, where the ANC really, it's a document done in the 50s, where there was segregation in America. And the ANC calls for South Africans all for one and all. So the ANC DNA is not bigotry, it's not racism, it's not against black and white. It's a document that is unbelievably progressive, done, as I said, in the 50s. Our problem we sit is, where we've had to show the government, is if you carry on bashing Israel. So pro-Palestinian, no problem. I mean, I regard myself as pro-Palestinian because I do want to see a Palestinian state created. I do believe it will be the best thing for Israel. I'm telling you, as a white South African, after black South Africans, the most liberated people was the white Afrikaner and the white minority who was oppressing them. You get unbelievably liberated as the oppressor, as being oppressed. And that was one of the great things Mandela taught black and white across the board. So I really do believe that there should be a Palestinian state. Stand by it. And I do believe the two parties need to, work it out, that no war will end all wars. You're going to have to eventually talk it. Who's to blame and who part of history is the big discussion, the big question we can all discuss. So the ANC doesn't want the white Jewish community having anti-Semitism. I mean, we have showed, like, the most anti-Israel ANC members, which is the guy Gwedi Mantashe, who's our Minister of Minerals and Mining, and he's the chairman of the ANC, that there's a spark in anti-Semitism when there's ANC rhetoric from, at that stage, was the Deputy Secretary General, Jesse Duarte. He actually comes up with a statement. So they're very, very, they really want to protect the South African Jewish community from anti-Semitism, and they have no tolerance of anti-Semitism. And that anti-Semitism is your traditional anti-Semitism from your far right, your Nazis, your white supremacists. The complexity comes of your anti-Semitism coming out of your Muslim left-wing community, which has always hit Israel for being a player in history. And that's the complexities. And I say that's where we have had to fight back as a community, as a board of deputies, is to explain the complexities and to explain that you can be pro-Palestinian, but don't be used by anti-Semites to destroy the Jewish state, which will then lead us back into another Holocaust. Because without a sliver of land, we know as black South Africans, when no one looks after you if you don't have your own piece of land. And that's the complexities that we have had to try and explain. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. But in South Africa, there's an unbelievable commitment of engaging and talking. And that really comes from both sides, I must say, black and white alike. And I'd like to believe that what South Africa could import into the region is this obsession about you have to just keep talking. And it's complex. We're far from living in Canada, Australia, or even America. But I do think America, unfortunately, is becoming more split on political lines. I think American Jewry's got a very, very tough future ahead of how to reconcile. We have had that. We have had to live with that for 20 years now, 15, 18 years. And even in the 70s, I had to live with it, which I suppose sometimes we don't always do the correct thing of the time. So, yeah, I mean, I hope that can help. But we definitely got to the pandemic of hatred of Israel ahead of the rest of the world. And you have to educate that hating Israel is a form of anti-Semitism.
Zev, we could listen to you for the entire day, but we need to take time for questions, and we only have 10 minutes left. So, Belle, if you want to.
Thank you, Eliseo, and thank you, Zev. Our first question comes from AJC CEO David Harris, who writes, "Thank you, Zev, Eliseo, Marion, and Stan. We value the long-standing relationship. Looking ahead, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the Jewish future in South Africa? Are younger Jews staying, leaving, or sitting on their suitcases? Is there any Jewish immigration to South Africa today or likelihood of it?
Very good question. So look, currently the South African Jewish community is not in a great, what's the word I'm looking for, psychological state. I'm talking pre-COVID, I'm not talking COVID, everyone's not in a good psychological state. But pre-COVID, we had these terrible dark years of corruption and feeling there wasn't a future. I was very impressed with the ANC pushing back with President Ramaphosa, pushing back on corruption and actually changing. We could have landed up in a semi-dictatorship. But I was quite optimistic. But to be honest with you, immigration's at some of its highest wave. South Africa had quite a few big waves of immigration. You had what was called the Sharp Fall, which was the late 60s, then the Soweto riots in 76, and then just before 94. So it's every 10 years there's immigration, and then our last big immigration was in the mid 2000s, 2005, 2006. There was a lot of violent crime, which Jews were violently murdered for crime, and there was a lot of being held up, hijacks, whatever, and that immigration in some ways is where we are now, and we haven't had that issue. Okay, we don't live, we live with we live big walls and electric fences, so it's not like we crime free, but that's been managed. The complexities, a lot of people don't see a future in South Africa. South Africa has become very expensive. If you want to live the privileged white existence, which means you need your private medical aid, you need your private schooling, you need all the rest of it. Israel's become a big option for a lot of South Africans. The Israeli economy looks far better than ours. So I would say reality-wise, there is a lot of immigration. There's a lot of houses in the Jewish areas up for sale. The aliyah rates are very high, which is exciting. I'd say the majority of South African Jewry, which used to go all over the world, I would say almost 60% now are going to Israel. So I still think we have a bright future. I do think we're in one of our more difficult, darker moments as a South African Jewish community where the immigration is high. People are feeling it. A lot of rich South African Jews who used to look after the community have left or have immigrated. The structures are getting tougher. Structures are getting more difficult. I still see a future in South Africa. We're in a free market economy. We've got a free press. We have our freedoms. We have our civil liberties. We have some of the lowest forms of anti-Semitism. And we have an unbelievably cohesive Jewish community, which a lot of people discount. And that's between your secular and your religious and your far right and your far left even. But really for me, on a religious basis, you don't have the conflict, whether it's conservative, reform, and orthodox and all positioning. The community is unbelievably as one on those issues. So I think a lot of times when you have to immigrate, you have to make a decision which camp you sit in. As in South Africa, you don't. But I would like to believe the future is bright. There is going to be a critical point where there's going to be too many Jews that have immigrated. And I do think then we'll start going into a more difficult period of not being an active actor as a Jewish community in South Africa, and we'll be under a bit more pressure and strain. I think we're far from there. I'd like to see immigration get less, but immigration is only going to get less if there's an economic future for South African Jews, and a lot of people aren't feeling that. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens after COVID with the rest of the world. But I'm cautiously optimistic. The only immigration that is really coming into South Africa, which is Jewish currently, is from the Lubavitch community, from the Chabad community. They love Israel, they love South Africa. They see it as a great future. They see it, and their community is growing, and they're very positive. But in your normal secular, which is the majority of South African Jewry, they've started immigrating more. And in your religious Zionist community, they've also started. There's been quite big numbers, even through COVID. I mean, the aliyah rates, 50, 60 South Africans are leaving almost on a monthly basis, which for a community with only 60,000, I don't know how long that's going to last. I think a lot of people have lost jobs. They don't feel they're going to rebuild. So, well, let's just make aliyah. We'll get our rights and that. So we are in a vulnerable scenario, but I'm optimistic we'll come through. The country will settle and we'll start growing again.
Thank you, Zev. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. I apologize to our viewers. There were many asked, but I'm going to pick the one that was kind of most frequently raised, including from Janice Ellen and AJC Board of Governor members in Atlanta and others who said, you know, you seem pretty optimistic about race relations in South Africa, but are wondering, do you feel that we need a new figure to fill the void of Mandela and others to create real trust and cooperation between the races and different sects of society in South Africa, particularly as race is a question that is very much on the mind of particularly Americans and others?
So it's funny, I actually think President Ramaphosa, when it comes to race relations, has been unbelievable. And the irony is, I mean, I know President Zuma pushed the race card, but he pushed it really so they could steal more and hide behind racism. But I think President Ramaphosa's ratings, and you can see it in the last elections, a lot of whites started voting for him again, which didn't happen under President Zuma, and for that matter, President Mbeki. President Mbeki was a lot more complicated in the white community of trust. I think President Ramaphosa does have the white community in trust. I think the white community is nervous of the ANC and the theft. But on the pure race relation, I do believe President Ramaphosa is the closest we have had to President Mandela. I mean, the whole Black Lives Matter, there were people who tried to push it in South Africa, but it doesn't happen. You're not having white cops killing black civilians. It just doesn't happen. The majority of South African police service is black. You know, so you do get police brutality, but it's not built on racist lines. So I think that's one of our lower issues in this country. South Africa's biggest challenge is economically. We have to get the black South Africans more part of the economy, and we have to allow white South Africans to feel like they live in a country that they can trust the government, that they can also make money, and that they can also do well, not at the expense of their fellow black South Africans. So I think South Africa is going to be, if the South African government can stop the corruption, and if they can kickstart this economy, and if you can get investment, and overseas people see a future, and if overseas people and locals see it, I think we can come out of it. But for me, South Africa's challenge is economic. It's not race.
Zev, that concludes our session. I want to thank you so much for doing this, for amplifying into beyond the Africa Institute into the wider world, the remarkable friendship that we've had for so many years. Your hospitality, unstinting support and hospitality every time we've visited your country, the people you've introduced us to, and the care with which you've nurtured our relationship. So we wish you the best in these troubling times, and we look forward to the work ahead.
Thank you very much. And once again, thank you so much to Eliseo, Marion, to the whole of the AJC. It's just been your partnership. You do not understand how important it is for us to live our lives. We wouldn't be able to live the lives we live with so little anti-Semitism without the big brothers of the AJC and our fellow Jewish brothers throughout the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you both for such a fascinating and important conversation. And thank you again, Zev, for being with us today. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation to AJC at ajc.org/donate. Thank you and goodbye.